The fluorescent lights in the grocery store buzzed overhead as Maria Rodriguez scanned another can of tomatoes, her movements mechanical after 8 hours on her feet. The afternoon shift at Save Mart stretched endlessly, each beep of the scanner, a reminder of bills piling up at home. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she reached for her water bottle, stealing a moment to massage her aching lower back. "Maria, checkout 3 needs backup," crackled through her walkie-talkie. She sighed, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. At 28, she felt decades older than her years. The weight of supporting herself through community college, while working full-time, showed in the tired lines around her brown eyes. Her uniform polo shirt, faded from countless washes, hung loose on her small frame. The constant ache in her feet had become a familiar companion, a reminder of the double shifts she'd been pulling to cover her tuition for the upcoming semester. Education was her way out, always had been. Even as a child, when her mother worked late cleaning office buildings and Maria would sit alone at their tiny kitchen table doing homework by the light of a single lamp, she'd known that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from her. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, watched from the customer service desk with disapproving eyes. The woman had made it clear that Maria's occasional absences for classes and study groups were not appreciated, even though Maria always found coverage for her shifts. It was another reminder of the precarious balance she maintained between survival and dreams. How quickly everything could fall apart if she made one wrong move. The smell of floor cleaner and fluorescent lighting gave her a headache most days. The constant hum of refrigerators and the squeaking wheels of shopping carts created a symphony of retail monotony that followed her home in her dreams. But it was honest work, and it paid just enough to keep her small studio apartment and put food on the table. More importantly, it allowed her the flexibility to attend classes 3 days a week. The automatic doors swooshed open as another wave of customers entered, bringing with them the crisp October air of suburban Denver. Maria had always loved this time of year, the golden aspens painting the mountains, the promise of snow, the way the light slanted differently through her tiny apartment window. But today, exhaustion clouded even simple pleasures. Maria had been named after her father's grandmother, a detail she'd learned from her mother during one of their late-night conversations in the weeks before Elena's death. He said she was the strongest woman he'd ever known, Elena had whispered from her hospital bed. Raised 6 children alone after her husband died in a mining accident. He wanted you to have that strength. The irony wasn't lost on Maria, that her father had named her after strength and then abandoned her to develop it on her own. But she had developed it, piece by piece, through every missed meal when money was tight, every night spent studying, instead of socializing, every time she'd chosen the practical path over the easy one. Her phone buzzed against her hip. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her glance at the screen during a brief lull between customers. The area code was local, but she didn't recognize the number. Collection agencies sometimes called from random numbers, trying to catch people off guard. "Hello?" she answered, wedging the phone between her shoulder and ear as she continued scanning items for an elderly woman who was methodically organizing her groceries in her cart. "Hello?" she answered, wedging the phone between her shoulder and ear as she continued scanning items. "Is this Maria Elena Rodriguez?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Maria. Who's calling?" "My name is Jonathan Brennan. I'm an attorney with Brennan, Walsh & Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Thomas Mitchell Hartwell." Maria's hand stilled on a bag of apples. The name hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting this call for weeks. Her father, the man who'd walked out when she was 7, leaving her mother to raise her alone in a cramped apartment above a laundromat. Yes, I heard about his passing," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to inform you that you're named in Mr. Hartwell's will. There's going to be a reading this Friday at 2 o'clock. Can you make it to our offices?" A will reading, like something out of an old movie. Maria's throat constricted. "I don't understand. We hadn't spoken in over 20 years. Nevertheless, your presence is required. The address is 1247 17th Street, Suite 3200, downtown Denver. Can I count on you being there? The customer in front of her cleared his throat. Impatiently, Maria fumbled with a bunch of bananas, nearly dropping them. I work on Fridays. I don't know if I can get the time off. Miss Rodriguez, I strongly advise you to make arrangements. This is quite important. After hanging up, Maria stood, frozen behind her register until her supervisor's sharp voice cut through her daze. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of confusion and dread. Thomas Hartwell, her father, had been a name whispered in bitter tones by her mother, accompanied by warnings about men who made promises they couldn't keep. That evening, Maria sat in her studio apartment, staring at a box she'd kept hidden under her bed for years. The apartment was small but clean, with a Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, and a kitchenette that consisted of a mini fridge, a hot plate, and a microwave she'd bought secondhand. The walls were bare, except for her community college diploma and a photo of her mother from happier times. Inside the box were the few remnants of her father's presence in her life. A birthday card he'd sent when she turned 8, the last one, a photo of them at a carnival when she was 5, and a small teddy bear he'd won for her that same day. The bear's fur was matted now, one eye hanging by a thread. She'd carried it everywhere as a child, until one day her mother gently suggested it might be time to put it away. There was also a child's drawing she'd made for Father's Day when she was 6, a crayon picture of 2 stick figures holding hands, under a rainbow. She'd written, "I love you, Daddy," in purple letters across the top, each letter carefully formed with the concentration only a child could muster. Her mother had never thrown it away, even after everything that happened. She'd Googled him once, years ago, during a particularly difficult period after her mother's first bout with illness. The search had led her to articles about Hartwell Construction, a successful company that built luxury homes in Denver's affluent suburbs. The photos showed a distinguished man in expensive suits, silver-haired and confident. Nothing like the father she remembered, who'd worn paint-stained jeans and smelled of coffee and cigarettes. The articles painted a picture of a successful businessman who'd built his company from the ground up, overcoming early financial difficulties to become one of Denver's most respected contractors. There were photos of him at charity events, cutting ribbons at groundbreaking ceremonies, accepting awards from the Chamber of Commerce. A life that seemed completely disconnected from the man who'd read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot of their old apartment complex. Her phone rang again. This time it was her best friend, Carmen, calling from the restaurant where she worked as a server. "You sound weird," Carmen said without preamble. "What's wrong?" Maria found herself spilling everything. The lawyer's call, the will reading, the flood of memories she'd spent years suppressing. Carmen listened without interruption, the sound of clinking dishes and kitchen noise a comforting backdrop. "Mija, you have to go," Carmen said finally. "What if he left you something? What if this could change everything for you?" "Carmen, you don't understand. His real family probably doesn't even know I exist. His wife, his other kids. I'm just some mistake from his past. Or maybe you're not. Maybe there's more to this story." That night, Maria lay awake staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from passing cars sweep across the walls. She thought about her mother, who died 3 years ago from cancer, working double shifts as a cleaning lady right up until the chemo made it impossible. Elena Rodriguez had never remarried, never spoke kindly of Maria's father, but sometimes Maria caught her staring at nothing with an expression of profound sadness. He wasn't always like that, her mother had said once, during one of their last conversations in the hospital. Before the drinking got bad, before the business started failing the first time. He had dreams, Mija. Big dreams. Maybe too big. By Thursday evening, Maria had made her decision. She requested Friday afternoon off, enduring her manager's irritated, sighs and pointed comments about reliability. She spent her last $20 on a simple black dress from a thrift store and borrowed Carmen's good shoes. Friday morning dawned gray and cold, with low clouds hugging the mountains like a shroud. Maria had barely slept, her mind cycling through possibilities and fears about what the day would bring. She'd laid out her thrift store dress the night before, pressing it carefully with the iron she'd borrowed from her neighbor. It was simple and black, appropriate for a funeral or a legal meeting, both of which seemed fitting for the occasion. The bus ride to downtown Denver took over an hour, requiring 2 transfers through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from working class to professional. Maria watched the transformation through the windows, chain restaurants giving way to bistros, laundromats replaced by boutiques, apartment complexes yielding to sleek condominiums. She arrived at the gleaming office tower with 15 minutes to spare, using the extra time to walk around the block and steel her nerves. The building stretched 30 floors into the overcast sky, its glass facade reflecting the busy street below. A small plaza at the building's base featured carefully manicured trees and modern sculptures that probably cost more than most people made in a year. In the lobby, she felt immediately out of place among the suited professionals striding purposefully toward the elevators. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and fresh flowers arranged in enormous vases filled the space with the scent of expensive perfume. Security guards in crisp uniforms watched from behind a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. Maria's reflection in the elevator's polished steel walls showed a young woman trying too hard to look composed, clutching a worn purse with white knuckles. She'd borrowed Carmen's good shoes, which were half a size too big, and made a soft clicking sound with each step. The elevator rose smoothly and silently, the city shrinking away below. The law office on the 32nd floor exuded quiet wealth, mahogany, furniture that gleamed under soft lighting, Persian rugs that probably had more value than Maria's annual income, and oil paintings of landscapes and historical scenes that spoke of old money and established power. The reception area featured leather chairs that looked like they'd never actually been sat in, and coffee table books about art and architecture that no one seemed to read. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and understated jewelry, directed her to a conference room where she was told to wait. The woman's smile was professional but distant, the kind reserved for people who didn't quite belong in this rarefied atmosphere. The conference room where Maria waited featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. Through the glass, Denver spread out below like a detailed map. The grid of streets she knew so well from bus routes and walking, the neighborhoods where she'd worked various jobs over the years, the small corner of the city that contained her entire world. She could see the direction of her own neighborhood from here, though it was too far away to make out individual buildings. Somewhere out there was the small apartment where she'd grown up, where her mother had worked herself to, death trying to provide for them both. The apartment complex where she'd learned to ride her bike in the parking lot, where she'd waited by the window for a father who stopped coming. The conference table was large enough to seat 12 people, made of what looked like a single piece, of dark wood polished to perfection. Legal pads and expensive pens had been placed at each seat, and a crystal water pitcher sat in the center alongside glasses that caught the light like prisms. Maria had been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes when she heard voices in the hallway, conversations that stopped abruptly as they approached the door. She straightened in her chair, smoothing her dress one more time and checking that her hair was still neatly pinned back. She was still lost in thought, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming, when the voices in the hallway grew louder, approaching the conference room with purpose and authority. The conference room door opened with a soft click, and Maria's stomach dropped as 3 people entered, their conversation dying the moment they saw her. The family resemblance was unmistakable. They all shared Thomas Hartwell's sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes, features Maria had inherited, but which looked foreign on her olive-toned face. The woman leading the group was around 50, impeccably, dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect bob, and diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. This had to be Catherine Hartwell, the widow. Behind her walked two people who were clearly siblings, a man in his early 30s wearing a tailored navy suit, and a woman slightly younger, with the same blonde hair as Catherine, though hers fell in soft waves to her shoulders. Both carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who'd never worried about money. Catherine's ice-blue eyes swept over Maria with unconcealed disdain, taking in every detail of her appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to judging others by their clothing and accessories. You must be the Rodriguez girl, not Maria, not even Thomas's daughter. Just the Rodriguez girl, as if she were a problem to be categorized and dismissed. The dismissive tone carried undertones of class and racial prejudice that Maria had encountered before but never quite so brazenly displayed. "I'm Maria," she said, standing and extending her hand. Catherine glanced at it but didn't take it, leaving Maria's arm hanging awkwardly in the air. The snub was deliberate and pointed, designed to establish hierarchy from the first moment. Catherine Hartwell," the woman said, claiming a seat at the head of the polished conference table with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "These are my children, Bradley and Sophia." Bradley nodded curtly in Maria's direction but didn't approach. He had his father's build, tall and broad-shouldered. But where Thomas had been warm in her childhood memories, Bradley radiated cold calculation. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with the kind of precision that required regular visits to a high-end salon. Everything about him spoke of privilege and power, exercised without question. Sophia at least offered a tight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of polished perfection that came from a lifetime of professional styling and expensive cosmetics. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves that looked effortless, but probably required an hour of careful attention each morning. Unlike her brother's hostility, her attitude seemed more cautious than aggressive. "I have to say, we were all quite surprised to learn of your existence," Catherine continued, her voice carrying the cultivated tones of someone born to privilege. Each word was precisely enunciated, with the kind of diction that suggested expensive private schools and elite social circles. "Thomas never mentioned having a daughter from before our marriage." The words stung more than Maria had expected. She'd known intellectually that her father had built a new life, but hearing it confirmed so bluntly that she'd been erased from his history, never even mentioned to the people closest to him, felt like a fresh wound opening in her chest. The words stung, but Maria forced herself to remain composed. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know this must be a difficult time." Sophia let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Difficult? Try confusing. We had to find out about you from a lawyer. Imagine how that felt." "Look," Bradley interjected, his voice sharp with impatience and barely controlled anger. "Let's cut to the chase here. We all know why we're gathered. Dad's gone and somehow you've managed to insert yourself into his will. But whatever you're expecting, you should know that we intend to contest any bequest made to you." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and anger that made her skin burn. "I didn't insert myself anywhere. I was contacted by Mr. Brennan. I didn't even know your father had included me in his will." "Our father," Catherine corrected, her tone arctic. The possessive emphasis was deliberate, another way of marking territory and establishing that Maria was an outsider. "Thomas was our father. You were just a complication from his past." The casual cruelty of the dismissal left Maria momentarily speechless. She'd expected hostility, but the complete lack of acknowledgement of her relationship to Thomas felt like being erased from existence. These people didn't just dislike her. They seemed to view her as fundamentally illegitimate, unworthy of even basic human courtesy. The conference room fell silent, except for the muted sounds of traffic 32, floors below, and the barely audible hum of the building's climate control system. Maria stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while feeling increasingly small and out of place. The silence stretched uncomfortably, filled with unspoken judgments and barely contained hostility. Maria could feel the weight of their collective disapproval pressing down on her like a physical force. "You know what I think?" Bradley leaned back in his chair, studying Maria like she was a specimen under a microscope. "I think you somehow found out about Dad's illness and manipulated him. Maybe you visited him in the hospital, played on his guilt about abandoning you." "I never saw him," Maria said quietly. "I didn't even know he was sick until I read his obituary." "Online." "Right," Sophia said, rolling her eyes. "And we're supposed to believe that he just randomly decided to include his bastard daughter in his will after ignoring her for 20 years? The crude word hit Maria like a slap. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this." "Actually, you do," Catherine said smoothly. "If you want to hear the will read, you need to wait for Jonathan. But let me save you some time and disappointment. Thomas built everything he had after he married me. The company, the houses, the investments, all of it happened during our marriage. Legally, you have no claim to any of it." "I don't want anything from you people," Maria shot back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I came here because the lawyer said I had to. I didn't ask to be included in any will, and I certainly didn't ask to be treated like some kind of criminal." Bradley laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "You don't want anything? Then why are you here? Why aren't you at work at whatever minimum wage job you're pretending to care about?" The casual cruelty of his words left Maria breathless. How did he know about her job? Had they researched her? The thought made her skin crawl. "My son has a point," Catherine said, her voice deceptively gentle. "If you truly don't want anything from Thomas's estate, you could simply waive any claim and leave now. It would save everyone a lot of trouble." Maria looked around the room at these three people who shared her blood, but felt like strangers from another planet. They lived in a world of private schools and country clubs, summer homes and investment portfolios. What could she possibly have in common with them? But something in their eagerness to get rid of her sparked a stubborn flame. Her mother had raised her to be proud, to never back down from bullies, no matter how well dressed they were. "I'll wait for the lawyer," she said, retaking her seat. The next 20 minutes passed in tense silence. Catherine and her children conducted whispered conversations while shooting occasional glances at Maria, who tried to appear calm while her heart hammered against her ribs. She studied the family photos scattered around the room, images of happy gatherings, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies. A life she'd never been part of, filled with a father who'd been present for these children in ways he'd never been for her. When Jonathan Brennan finally entered, he brought with him the energy of a man running late and the slight dishevelment that suggested he'd been dealing with urgent matters elsewhere. He was younger than Maria had expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly rumpled appearance that somehow made him seem more trustworthy than the polished perfection surrounding her. His briefcase was worn leather, showing signs of daily use, and his suit, while well-made, had the comfortable fit of clothing chosen for practicality rather than impression. There was something reassuring about his lack of pretension in this room, full of people who seemed to weaponize their appearance. "My apologies for the delay," he said, setting a thick folder on the table and pulling out a laptop with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing complex legal matters. "There were some last-minute details to confirm with the bank, and I wanted to ensure all the documentation was properly prepared. I trust everyone has had a chance to get acquainted." The word acquainted hung in the air like a bad joke, given the tension that had been building in the room for the past half hour. Catherine's smile was razor-sharp, the kind of expression that could cut glass. "We've had a lovely chat." Maria caught the sarcasm, but said nothing. She was beginning to understand that this family communicated in layers of subtext and barely veiled hostility, a language she'd never learned to speak fluently. Excellent. Well, let's proceed then. Jonathan opened his laptop and withdrew several documents from his folder, arranging them with practiced precision. Before we begin with the formal reading, I want to explain that Thomas came to me about 6 months ago to update his will. He was very specific about his wishes and spent considerable time ensuring everything was exactly as he wanted it. 6 months ago. Maria did quick math in her head, her heart sinking as she realized the timeline. That would have been shortly after his cancer diagnosis, according to the obituary she'd found online. The thought that he'd been thinking about her during what must have been one of the most frightening periods of his life felt both heartbreaking and bewildering. He also left specific instructions about how this meeting should be conducted, Jonathan continued. But first, the standard bequests. He began reading in the formal language of legal documents. Catherine inherited the house, a sprawling estate in Cherry Hills Village worth several $1 million. Bradley received a substantial trust fund and partnership in the construction company. Sophia got another trust fund and the vacation home in Aspen. With each bequest, Maria felt herself shrinking further into her chair. These people were inheriting more money than she could imagine, sums that represented security and opportunity beyond her wildest dreams. Finally, Jonathan's voice shifted slightly. And to my daughter, Maria Elena Rodriguez. The room went deadly, quiet. Even the city sounds outside seemed to fade away. To my daughter, Maria Elena Rodriguez, Jonathan continued, his voice steady, despite the tension crackling through the room. I leave the sum of $50,000 to be used for her education, or as she sees fit, along with all contents, of Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank of Denver, $50,000. The number echoed in Maria's mind like a distant bell. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of having, enough to finish her degree without working, enough to maybe even think about graduate school. But the silence that followed Jonathan's words felt heavy with unspoken fury. Bradley was the first to explode. 50,000? Are you kidding me? Dad leaves some stranger 50 grand while we're the ones who built the company with him, who were actually part of his life? It's not about the money, Catherine said, though her white knuckles, gripping the table, suggested otherwise. It's about principle. Thomas was clearly not in his right mind when he made these changes. The cancer, the medications, they obviously affected his judgment. I can assure you that your husband was completely lucid when he made these arrangements, Jonathan said calmly. In fact, he anticipated there might be some resistance to his decisions. That's why he left specific instructions. He reached into his folder and withdrew a small tablet device. Maria noticed his hands were slightly trembling as he set it up on the table, angling the screen so everyone could see. Thomas recorded a video message specifically for this moment. He insisted it be played after the will was read, particularly if there were any objections to Maria's inheritance. Sophia leaned forward, her perfect composure finally cracking. What kind of video message? I think it's better if you see for yourselves, Jonathan said. His finger hovered over the play button, and Maria could see something like sympathy in his eyes as he looked at her. Maria, your father wanted you to know that he thought about this decision very carefully. Are you ready? Maria nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Her palms were sweating, and her mouth had gone completely dry. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly Thomas Hartwell was there. Not the young father from her memories, or the successful businessman from newspaper photos, but a gaunt man, clearly ravaged by illness. He was sitting in what looked like a hospital room, wearing a simple blue gown, his once thick hair reduced to wispy gray strands. But his eyes, those startling blue eyes she'd inherited, were completely alert and focused. If you're watching this, he began, his voice hoarser than Maria remembered, but still carrying the same gentle cadence that had read her bedtime stories decades ago. Then I'm gone, and you're all gathered together for the first and probably last time. Catherine, Bradley, Sophia, I know you're angry, And Maria? His gaze seemed to look directly at her through the screen. I know you're confused and probably hurt. Maria's vision blurred as tears she'd been holding back for 20 years finally spilled over. I need to tell you all some things I should have said while I was alive. Things that might change how you see this inheritance and how you see each other. Thomas shifted in his hospital bed, wincing slightly. Catherine, when we met, I told you I'd been married before, that it ended badly, and that there was a child. What I didn't tell you was why the marriage ended. Catherine's face went pale. Bradley and Sophia exchanged glances, confusion replacing their earlier anger. I was an alcoholic, Thomas continued matter-of-factly. Not the charming, functional kind you see in movies. The kind who disappears for days, who spends the grocery money on booze, who breaks promises to little girls who just want their daddy to come to their school play. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She remembered that school play, the Christmas pageant in 2nd grade. She'd been an angel, wearing a costume her mother had sewn from old bedsheets. She'd searched the audience for her father's face until the very end. Elena, Maria's mother. She gave me chance after chance. More chances than I deserved. But finally she had to choose between enabling my addiction and protecting our daughter. She chose Maria, thank God. She threw me out, got a restraining order, and I was too proud and too drunk to fight for visitation rights I probably wouldn't have used anyway. The conference room was completely silent now. Even the sound of breathing seemed muted. I got sober about 2 years after Elena kicked me out. Started going to AA, got my life together, started the construction company from nothing. But by then, Maria was settled in a new life, and I convinced myself she was better off without me. I told myself I was protecting her from my past mistakes. Thomas paused, reaching for a water glass with shaking hands. That was the real mistake, not the drinking. I couldn't help that. It was a disease. The real mistake was staying away, was letting pride and shame keep me from being the father she deserved. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dad, we don't need to hear. Yes, you do, Thomas said firmly, as if he could hear the interruption across time. Because what you don't know is that I never stopped trying to help Maria, even from a distance. When she was in high school and Elena got sick the first time, the lupus, I paid those medical bills. Anonymously through a foundation I set up. When Maria needed school supplies, when their car broke down, when Elena was between jobs, I made sure they were okay. Maria gasped audibly. Her mother had always wondered about those mysterious donations, the anonymous benefactor who seemed to appear whenever they needed help most. And when Elena was dying 3 years ago, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly, I was there, not in the room. She'd made it clear she didn't want to see me, but I was in that hospital every day. I paid for her private room, her pain medications, everything insurance wouldn't cover. The nurses knew me. I asked them to tell me how Maria was holding up. The tears were flowing freely down Maria's face now. She remembered those final weeks, how grateful she'd been for the private room, how the bills that should have bankrupted her had somehow been manageable. I watched her, Catherine, Bradley, Sophia. I watched my daughter work 2 jobs to put herself through school while taking care of her dying mother. I watched her sacrifice her own dreams to make sure Elena had dignity in her final days. I watched her give a eulogy at the funeral that made me proud and broke my heart at the same time. Catherine's perfect composure was cracking. Thomas, why didn't you tell us any of this? As if anticipating the question, Thomas looked directly into the camera. Because I was ashamed. Because it's easier to pretend the past doesn't exist than to admit you failed someone who needed you. And because I knew that if I told you about Maria, really told you about her, you'd realize she's twice the person I ever was. He shifted again, and Maria could see how much the conversation was costing him physically. Bradley, Sophia, you're... Both good kids. You've had every advantage I could give you, and you've made me proud in your own ways. But you've never been tested the way Maria has. You've never had to choose between your dreams and your family's survival. You've never had to work in a grocery store for 8 hours and then come home to study for exams, because education is your only shot at a better life. Bradley's jaw was clenched so tightly Maria could see the muscles jumping. The $50,000. I'm leaving Maria isn't charity. It's not even really an inheritance. It's a debt payment. Partial compensation for 20 years of child support I never paid, for birthday parties I missed, for all the ways I should have been there and wasn't. Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense despite his obvious exhaustion. But there's something else. Something I need you all to know about what kind of person Maria really is. Thomas's image on the screen seemed to gather strength as he prepared for what was clearly the most important part of his message. 6 months ago, when the doctors told me the cancer had spread and I probably had less than a year, I made a decision. I hired a private investigator, not to spy on Maria, but to find out if she even wanted to hear from me. I needed to know if reaching out would hurt her more than staying away. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, barely breathing as she waited for what came next. What I learned changed everything I thought I knew about the daughter I'd abandoned. Thomas's voice strengthened with obvious pride. The investigator discovered that Maria had been trying to find me for over 3 years. Not for money, not for revenge, but because she wanted to forgive me. The words hit the room like a physical force. Catherine's hand flew to her throat. Bradley and Sophia stared at the screen in stunned silence. She'd been saving money to hire her own investigator, money she could barely afford, setting aside $20 or $30 a month from her grocery store paycheck. She'd even started a letter to me. The investigator found drafts of it in her apartment. Want to know what it said? Thomas reached off camera and pulled out a piece of paper, clearly photocopied from Maria's own handwriting. "Dear Dad," he began reading, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if you'll want to hear from me, or if this letter will even reach you. Mom always said you were sick when I was little, that the drinking wasn't really your fault. I'm old enough now to understand that addiction is a disease, not a choice. I don't know what happened between you and Mom, but I know she loved you once, and I know you loved me. I remember you reading to me and teaching me to ride my bike, and the way you used to call me your little star." Maria's sobs were audible now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. Carmen had been right. There was more to this story than she'd ever imagined. "I'm not writing this because I want anything from you," Thomas continued reading. "I just want you to know that I forgive you for leaving. I forgive you for the broken promises and the missed birthdays. I understand now that sometimes people leave because they love us too much to hurt us anymore. But I also want you to know that I turned out okay. Mom did a good job raising me. I'm going to graduate from college next year, and I want to be a teacher. I think you'd be proud of who I became." The silence in the conference room was profound. Bradley had his head in his hands. Sophia was crying quietly. Catherine stared at the table, her perfect composure completely gone. "If you ever want to meet for coffee, just to talk, I'd like that. If you don't, I understand that too. But I needed you to know that I don't hate you. I never hated you. Love always, Maria." Thomas set the letter down and looked directly into the camera again. She never sent it because she ran out of money for the investigator before she could find my address. Her mother's final medical bills wiped out her savings, and she spent the next year working extra shifts just to keep her head above water. But she kept the letter, kept hoping for a chance to tell me she forgave me. He paused, struggling with emotion. That's when I knew I had to act. But I also knew that if I contacted her directly, she might think I was dying and feel obligated to pretend she cared, so I did something else instead. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, clearly knowing what was coming next. I went to her grocery store. Every Tuesday afternoon for 3 months, I shopped there. I watched her work, saw how she treated customers, how she helped elderly people reach high shelves, how she was patient with difficult people even when she was obviously exhausted. Maria's eyes widened. The nice older man who always came in on Tuesdays, who bought random items and always seemed to end up in her line, who complimented her customer service and left small tips in the charity jar. She'd thought he was just a lonely widower making conversation. I saw her help a young mother who was counting food stamps, quietly paying the difference when the woman came up short. I saw her give her own lunch to a homeless man who came in asking for work. I watched her cover an extra shift for a coworker whose child was sick, even though she was already working doubles. Thomas smiled through his tears. I saw who she really was. Not just who she'd become despite my failures as a father, but who she was in her heart. Kind, generous, strong, dignified. Everything I'd hoped she would be, and more than I deserved. Bradley looked up from his hands, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. On my last visit to that store, I finally worked up the courage to speak to her beyond small talk. I asked her what she was studying in school. She lit up when she talked about wanting to teach elementary school, about helping kids who might not have support at home. She said every child deserved to feel valued and loved. Thomas's voice broke completely. She was talking about herself, of course, about the little girl who'd waited for her daddy to come to her school play. But instead of being bitter about it, she'd turned her pain into purpose. She wanted to be for other children what no one had been for her. The implications of his words settled over the room like a weight. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about character, about what really mattered in a family. That day, I introduced myself properly. I told her I was Thomas Hartwell, and I watched her face change as she realized who I was. She didn't cry, didn't get angry, didn't make a scene. She just looked at me with those eyes, my eyes, and said, "I wondered if I'd ever see you again." Maria remembered that moment with crystal clarity. The shock of recognition, the way her heart had hammered as 20 years of wondering finally ended. We talked for 10 minutes after her shift ended. She asked about my health. The investigator had told her I was sick. She asked if I was in pain, if I was scared. Not one word about the past, not one recrimination. Just concern for a man who'd abandoned her, asking if he was okay. Thomas wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. When I told her about the will, about wanting to leave her something, she tried to refuse. Said she didn't want to cause problems with my family, didn't want to take anything that belonged to my other children. I had to convince her that $50,000 wouldn't make a dent in the estate, that it was less than I'd spent on either Bradley or Sophia's college education. Bradley winced at the comparison. "But here's the thing that none of you know yet," Thomas said, his voice growing, stronger again. "The safety deposit box I'm leaving to Maria doesn't just contain some keepsakes and documents. It contains something that changes everything about this inheritance." He reached off camera again and held up a thick manila envelope. "Maria, when you open that box, you're going to find the deed to 847 acres of undeveloped land in Jefferson County. Land I bought 15 years ago for almost nothing because it was considered worthless, too rocky for farming, too remote for development." Catherine leaned forward, confusion evident on her face. "Last month, that land was rezoned for commercial development. Next week, the state is announcing plans for a new highway interchange that will run right through the middle of it. The property is now worth approximately $12 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I'm leaving it to Maria not because she's my forgotten daughter, but because she's the only one of my children who understands what it means to struggle, what it means to value something because you've earned it rather than inherited it." Bradley's face had gone completely white. Sophia looked like she might be sick. Catherine, Bradley, Sophia, you're all wealthy in your own right now. The inheritance I've left you represents security and comfort for the rest of your lives. But Maria has spent her entire adult life working for everything she has. She deserves a chance to build something of her own. Thomas leaned back against his pillows, looking exhausted but peaceful. I'm not asking you to love each other. I'm not asking you to be a family. I gave up the right to ask for that 20 years ago. But I am asking you to respect each other. Maria has shown more grace and maturity in the past 6 months than I showed in 20 years of fatherhood. He looked directly into the camera one more time. Maria, mija, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it anyway. Use that money to build the life you've dreamed of. Become the teacher you want to be. Help those kids the way I should have helped you. And remember that even though I wasn't there for most of your life, I was proud of you every single day. His image flickered and went dark. The conference room fell into absolute silence. Outside, Denver continued its daily rhythm. But inside, this space, 4 people sat stunned by revelations that had rewritten everything they thought they knew. Maria was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. $12 million? Jonathan nodded solemnly. The paperwork is already filed. The property legally transfers to you upon probate completion, which should be within 60 days. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. Thomas was clearly manipulated. Mrs. Hartwell, Jonathan interrupted gently but firmly. Your husband came to me completely lucid and without any outside influence. I have medical documentation of his mental competency at the time he made these arrangements. He also anticipated potential legal challenges and took steps to ensure his wishes would be honored. Bradley found his voice, though it sounded hollow. What kind of steps? He had the will witnessed by 3 independent parties, including his oncologist. He underwent psychological evaluation to confirm his decision-making capacity, and he left detailed written explanations for every bequest, including the reasoning behind Maria's inheritance. Sophia looked at Maria, really looked at her, for the first time since entering the room. You really didn't know about any of this. Maria shook her head, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. I thought he'd forgotten I existed. I thought... She trailed off, overwhelmed. You thought he didn't love you, Sophia said quietly. Yeah. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls of class and resentment wavered. Catherine gathered her purse and coat with sharp, efficient movements. This isn't over. We'll be consulting with our own attorneys. That's your right, Jonathan said calmly. But I should warn you that contesting this will would likely result in lengthy legal proceedings that would benefit no one. Your husband's wishes were very clear, and his preparations were thorough. As Catherine headed for the door, she paused and looked back at Maria. I hope you're satisfied, she said, her voice arctic with controlled fury. Maria met her gaze steadily. I'm not satisfied about any of this. I would trade every penny to have had a father who was present for my childhood. But I can't change the past, and apparently neither can you. The simple dignity of her response seemed to deflate some of Catherine's anger. Without another word, she left, Bradley following silently behind her. Sophia lingered for a moment, studying Maria with curious eyes. He really used to call you his little star? Maria nodded, surprised by the gentleness in Sophia's voice. He used to call me that too, Sophia said softly. When I was very small before. She stopped herself. I'm sorry. For how we treated you today, this whole situation is just... complicated, Maria finished. Yeah, complicated. Sophia hesitated at the door. Maybe sometime we could have coffee. I mean, we are sisters, technically. The word sisters hung in the air like a bridge. Neither of them was quite ready to cross, but which might be possible someday. After Sophia left, Maria sat alone with Jonathan in the quiet conference room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the polished table. Are you okay? Jonathan asked gently. Maria laughed, but it came out more like a sob. I don't think I know what okay means anymore. This morning, I was worried about making rent, and now you're a multimillionaire, Jonathan said with a gentle smile. It's a lot to process. Maria stared out the window at the city below. He was there. All those months, he was watching me at work, and I had no idea. He was very proud of you. That came through clearly in every conversation we had. But why didn't he just tell me who he was from the beginning? We could have had more time. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, considering his words. I think he was afraid. Your father carried a lot of guilt about abandoning you. He was terrified that if you knew he was dying, you might feel obligated to forgive him or spend time with him out of pity rather than genuine affection. That's ridiculous. I'd been trying to find him for years. But he didn't know that until he hired the investigator. By then he was already quite ill. Jonathan gathered his papers. Maria, there's something else. Your father left specific instructions about the property in Jefferson County. He wanted you to know that you don't have to develop it if you don't want to. The land has been in a conservation trust that expires in 6 months. You could choose to renew that trust, keep it as undeveloped wilderness forever if that's what feels right to you. The idea that her father had considered even that possibility, that she might choose preservation over profit, spoke to how well he'd come to know her character in those brief months of observation. What would you do? She asked. Jonathan smiled. That's not my decision to make. But I will say this. Your father believed you had the wisdom to make the right choice, whatever that might be for you. Maria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there was land that now belonged to her, land that could change not just her life, but the lives of countless students she hoped to teach. There's one more thing, Jonathan said, standing and handing her a key. The safety deposit box. Would you like to visit the bank today, or would you prefer to wait? Maria looked at the small silver key in her palm. Another piece of her father's puzzle, another revelation waiting to unfold. Today, she said decisively. I think I've waited long enough. The bank was only a few blocks away, and the walk gave Maria time to begin processing the seismic shift her life had just undergone. The busy streets of downtown Denver looked the same, but everything felt different, as if she were seeing the world through new eyes. At the bank, a polite attendant led her to the safety deposit box room. The box was larger than she'd expected, requiring both Maria's key and the bank's key to open. Inside, she found a collection of items that painted a picture of the father she'd lost and the man he'd become. There were photos, dozens of them, dating back to her childhood. Pictures of her at school events, graduation ceremonies, birthday parties with friends. Images he'd somehow obtained despite being absent from her life. The most recent ones showed her at her mother's funeral, standing gravely beside the casket, in a black dress borrowed from Carmen. Beneath the photos were documents, medical records showing his battle with alcoholism and subsequent sobriety, certificates from AA meetings spanning 15 years, and a thick folder labeled Maria's Educational Fund, filled with documentation of anonymous donations made to her school, her mother's medical expenses, and various other support provided over the years. But at the bottom of the box was something unexpected. A small wooden jewelry box, intricately carved and obviously old. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple gold locket. Maria opened it with trembling fingers and found 2 tiny photos. One of her as a baby, and one of a young woman she didn't recognize, but who had her same dark hair and serious eyes. There was a note tucked beneath the locket, written in her father's handwriting. Maria, this locket belonged to your grandmother, Elena Vasquez, your mother's mother, who died when your mother was young. Elena gave it to me when your mother and I got married, told me it should go to our first daughter. Your mother left it behind when she moved out, probably because it reminded her too much of broken promises. but it was always meant for you. Inside is a photo of you at 6 months old and one of your grandmother at about your age. The resemblance is remarkable. You carry the strength of all the women who came before you. Use it well. Con amor, papa. Papa. He'd never called himself. That when she was young, always just daddy or dad. But papa was what her mother had called her own father. What Maria had sometimes wished she could call hers. She fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart. It felt like coming home to a heritage she'd never known she'd lost. The final item in the box was a sealed envelope marked for Maria's wedding day. She stared at it for a long moment, then carefully placed it in her purse unopened. Some gifts were meant to wait for their proper time. As Maria left the bank, the setting sun painted Denver's skyline in shades of gold and rose. She walked slowly, in no hurry to return to her small apartment, to the life that no longer quite fit the person she was becoming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "How did it go? Call me when you can." Instead of calling, Maria found herself walking toward the restaurant where Carmen worked. She needed to see her friend's face when she told this story. Needed to ground herself in the one relationship that had remained constant through all the upheaval. Carmen was just finishing her shift when Maria arrived, and one look at her friend's face told her everything had changed. "Mija, you look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Maria said. "Carmen, I need to tell you about my father. The real story this time." They sat in a corner booth as the restaurant closed around them, Maria recounting every detail of the afternoon. Carmen listened without interruption, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. $12 million, Carmen finally said, shaking her head in amazement. "Maria, do you realize what this means? You could do anything, go anywhere. You could quit that awful job tomorrow." "I know. But Carmen, what if I'm not ready for this? What if I mess it up somehow?" Carmen reached across the table and took her friend's hands. "Listen to me. This didn't happen by accident. Your father could have left that money to anyone, but he chose you. He watched you for months, saw who you really are, and decided you were the one who deserved this chance. But his other children have had every advantage their whole lives. They've never had to choose between paying rent and buying textbooks. They've never worked 2 jobs just to survive. You have." Carmen's voice grew fierce with conviction. "You know what I think? I think your father finally did something right. He saw that you'd taken every hard thing that happened to you and used it to become stronger, kinder, more determined, and he decided it was time someone rewarded you for that." Maria felt tears threatening again, but these were different. Tears of possibility rather than grief. "What am I going to do with $12 million, Carmen?" "Whatever you want, Mija. That's the point. For the first time in your life, you get to choose your path instead of having it chosen for you by circumstances." That night, Maria sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions that had defined her adult life. The futon that served as both couch and bed, the card table where she studied, the few books she'd been able to afford, the single photo of her and her mother taken just months before Elena's death. Tomorrow she could start looking for a new place to live. She could quit her job at the grocery store, focus entirely on finishing her degree. She could think about graduate school, about the kind of teacher she wanted to become. But tonight, she wanted to sit with the magnitude of what had happened, to honor the complexity of grief and gratitude that filled her heart. Her father had been flawed, deeply flawed. His absence had shaped her childhood in ways that could never be undone. But he'd also been human, struggling with demons she was only beginning to understand, trying in his broken way to make amends for choices he couldn't take back. The locket around her neck caught the lamplight, and Maria thought about the women who'd worn it before her. Her grandmother, strong enough to emigrate from Mexico with nothing but hope. Her mother, strong enough to raise a daughter alone while working. Multiple jobs, and now her, inheriting not just money, but a legacy of resilience that had been passed down through generations. She thought about her half-siblings, about the hurt and confusion in their faces when they realized their father had secrets they'd never suspected. Perhaps someday they could find a way to be a family of sorts, bound not by shared childhoods, but by shared loss and the possibility of shared understanding. Most of all, she thought about the choice her father had given her. Not just the money, but the freedom to decide who she wanted to become. She could develop the land, creating jobs and opportunities for others. She could preserve it, protecting wild spaces for future generations. She could use the money for education, for travel, for experiences she'd never imagined possible. Or she could do something else entirely, something that honored both the practical lessons her mother had taught her and the complex legacy her father had left behind. As she prepared for bed, Maria made her first decision as a woman of means. Tomorrow she would call in sick to work, not because she was ready to quit, but because she needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to use this unexpected gift wisely. She would also call Sophia. The tentative offer of coffee had been genuine, and Maria found herself curious about the sister she'd never known she had. Perhaps they could help each other navigate the complex emotions their father's final gift had unleashed. But tonight, she would simply hold the locket and remember the sound of her father's voice, calling her his little star, grateful at last, to know that somewhere in his complicated heart, that had always been true. Outside her window, Denver slept under a canopy of stars, the same stars that had watched over her childhood dreams and her mother's struggles and her father's regrets. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new challenges, new chances to prove herself worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. For now, that was enough. 1 year later, Maria stood at the edge of what had once been her father's secret, 847. Acres of rolling hills and rocky outcroppings that stretched toward the front range of the Colorado Rockies. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and golden aspens dotted the landscape like scattered coins. In the distance, she could see the construction crews working on the new elementary school that would bear her mother's name, Elena. Rodriguez Elementary, where Maria would teach 3rd grade starting next month. The school was designed to serve children from low-income families in the surrounding area, built with sustainable materials and surrounded by preserved green space. She'd kept 400 acres as a nature preserve, donating it to the state, with the stipulation that it remain forever wild. The remaining 447 acres had been carefully developed into affordable housing and community spaces, generating enough income to fund the school's operations indefinitely. "It's beautiful," Sophia said, walking up beside her. The relationship between the half-sisters had been tentative at first, but had grown into something genuine over the months. "Dad would be proud," Maria smiled, adjusting the locket that had become her constant companion. "I think he would be, though I suspect he might be surprised that I didn't just take the money and run." "Are you kidding? He watched you for months. Remember? He knew exactly what kind of person you are." They stood in comfortable silence, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. The legal challenges Catherine had threatened never materialized. Perhaps because she'd realized the futility of fighting a will so carefully constructed, or perhaps because time had softened the sharp edges of grief and resentment. Bradley had surprised everyone by asking to be involved in the housing development project. His experience in construction had proven invaluable, and working together had given the siblings a chance to know each other as adults rather than rivals. "I have something for you," Sophia said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. "I found it when we were cleaning out Dad's office last week." Inside was a small worn copy of Charlotte's Web, with "For Maria, my little star," written in faded ink on the title page. It was the book he'd been reading to her the last time she'd seen him as a child. He kept it all these years, Maria said softly, running her fingers over the familiar cover. Along with everything else that reminded him of you. His office was like a shrine to the daughter he couldn't figure out how to reach. As they walked back toward the car, Maria thought about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She could have used the inheritance for personal gain, could have built a life of luxury and ease. Instead, she'd chosen to honor the values her mother had instilled and the hopes her father had harbored. The money had given her options, but it was the lessons learned from a lifetime of struggle that had shown her how to use those options wisely. She was still her mother's daughter, still the woman who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of community. But now she was also her father's child, inheriting not just his wealth, but his capacity for both profound mistakes and meaningful redemption. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "First day of teacher training tomorrow. Ready to change the world?" Maria smiled as she typed back, "One student at a time." As they drove away from the land that had changed everything, Maria caught sight of her reflection in the side mirror. She saw her father's eyes, her mother's determined chin, and her grandmother's strength looking back at her. The sum of all who had come before, ready to write the next chapter of a story that had begun in struggle but was now rich with possibility. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witness to all the small human dramas that played out in their shadow. But Maria knew that some changes, however small they might seem, had the power to ripple forward through generations, touching lives not yet born and dreams not yet dreamed. She was no longer just surviving. She was building something that would last.